Okay, if we should be able to start with the first speaker. First speaker.
First speaker proposition. Am I audible?
Yes, you're very, very, very audible. Kindly start.
Okay, my time will be starting in 3.
Just
Hello?
a minute. Joseph, are you going to be helping us keep time? Sorry? Joseph, are you keeping time on your end? Okay, I guess I'm not audible. Am I audible?
You're very audible, Rian, and yes, I'm going to keep time. Thank you.
Okay.
For the question.
Thank you.
The first speaker, you can start.
Okay, my time will be starting in 3, 2, 1. If you're in a school setting and you constantly have to do a test, but every time you're not ready for that test, you can simply say, I don't want to do it, I'll do it later. That becomes a problem in the long run. It makes you use that if no matter how ready you're not, you can always forgo the test. So already it goes against your stance at why you're at school. So now in this motion, that's kind of the similarity between that analogy I've just given. So now the clause 2 of Article 156 in the Constitution of Uganda, in brief, this is roughly saying that if we are ever to be in a financial hardware as a ministry, as the people who are enlightened on the budget, this comes to say that we can always come to ask for supplementary money, that on every budget there is supplementary money which can actually be brought about. Now, where does this come into today's debate? This now comes against the main roles and the interests of the parliament, which are proper planning and management plus governance for a sustainable country. Now, having this supplementary budget goes against the main actor of today's motion, the parliament. So now, as the main actor of today's motion, the parliament, why would we want to remove this supplementary money? Why do we want to have clause 2 of Article 156 100% gone away with? Now, this will take me into what? Our first level of argumentation. Now, when we have this supplementary money, this already goes against what one of the key interests of parliament, which is what? Planning. Now, planning and management is one of the roles of the parliament. We're the ones supposed to actually foresee how our country is being developed. We're the ones supposed to see how ministries are working. But if we have supplementary money going in, how does this go against proper planning? So this is how it's going to happen. Now, if it's supplementary money, this means the people who are going to be drawing budgets aren't going to draw budgets with the best terms set in mind. These are people who are going to draw budgets with a level of reluctance, knowing that in case an emergency actually comes about, at the end of the day, we can always just go ask for more money. Now, this becomes a bit problematic. How does this become problematic? This becomes problematic on the aspect that it's going to now cause an over-reliance, knowing that these people won't actually be doing the best accountability. Then if we are going to be over-reliant, that already destroys accountability now, which would now come to be a direct response to any case negative will come about saying about flexibility, that we need this money so that we can continue to stay flexible because we don't always know what can happen. But then this would have actually been battled if these people actually drawing budgets with the best accountability. If budgets are being drawn with the best accountability, this means all unforeseeable circumstances like natural disasters or whatever would actually be accounted for in this budget. So already over-reliance is destroying accountability. That's already a response. Now, if accountability is going to be lost, what does this do? Now, this is going to realize in the long run creates a backlash with investors. How does this come about? If the investors are going to realize this is a country which is always going to continue having, let's say we're just going to, get some more money. The investors are going to actually realize that this is a country which actually isn't going to plan best for them. And if the investors realize this country isn't going to be the best in planning for them. These are people going to go away from our country. These are people who are going to realize our country isn't actually a hub base set for this. So now this goes to parliament interest number two of governance. Now governance will come about since now the people who would have actually helped the country to develop by bringing in foreign exchange or whatever, they're actually going to realize this isn't a country because of a lack of accountability and over reliance and so on. And then number two, it leaves room for corruption. Now, corruption is when
in circumstances, say there is an epidemic or there is a disaster. Firstly, we already have organizations in place to counter for these things. That's why it happens in the COVID-19 pandemic. People are asking questions like what happened to Ministry of Disaster Preparedness and Refugees, because we already have bodies in place to counter for unforeseen circumstances. But even secondly, in the case of supplement, even in the case of budgets panel, I think opposition misunderstands how Uganda actually plans for its budget. The budget of a country, let's say if we are in 2023 this year, the budget was planned and released the year prior to this year. What that then means is that the budget you want to edit was carefully scrutinized a year before it was implemented. While in the case of opposition in today's debate, where they are going to supplement and they're going to rush during an emergency and then plan and develop something in 4 months, which is necessarily so low, which is given in the info slide, which is going to lead to a higher rate of things like embezzlement, a higher rate of things like inefficiency, because the government is now planning and rushing in their current status quo to provide a budget which is going to in most cases be inefficient. But even secondly, when they come and tell us that the parliament is going to be able to scrutinize these things, but I will tell you one thing. In the case where the budget is planned 6-7 months in the year before the year it's going to be implemented, it means that the ability or the rate of scrutinization is going to be more in the case of affirmative as compared to opposition's case where they are rushing in case of an emergency rejected. They are rushing to scrutinize these things. But even secondly, when they come and tell you that we give no alternative, but as affirmative in today's debate, this is our stance. We are telling you that in the case where there is a body or a ministry that is facing lack of funds to actually promote in case of disasters, we are telling you that this should be fronted the year before when the budget is being planned. And it is this sort of proper planning, and this came out in our first speech, it is this proper planning, this proper management, this proper accountability that will bring for better development in the long run. We proud to propose. So secondly, even when they come and tell us that things like the COVID-19 pandemic Yes, the COVID-19 pandemic was an unforeseen circumstance. So in the case where we have institutions being readily prepared and they are presenting their interests when the budget is being placed, it means that their ability to cope with unforeseen circumstances is going to be more in. So lastly, before I go to positive matter, on a bit of a comparative analysis, on the point of preparedness, I believe preparedness happens more on propositions world because we have institutions that are readily prepared and have systems in place such as better accounting for the money that they're spending, better monitoring their systems or their planning or their money reserves. And in the case where they have less, they present it to government or they present it to the parliament. In the case where they have less money, they present it to parliament prior to the budget being planned, so we escape the confusion. While in opposition's bench, they're going to be rushing. There's going to be embezzlement. Even the institutions themselves are going to be over-reliant on the parliament, which is what the parliament doesn't want, right? We came and told you the interest of the parliament as better governance. Even if opposition is to come and tell us that the parliament wants to make policies to fulfill the citizens, we believe even that by the time they're making the bodies or the institutions better accountable, it means that the citizens will also benefit, which is what the parliament wants. On positive matter, we gave you two arguments in the first speech. We came and told you firstly, this leads to over-reliance. How? We gave you three layers. Told you firstly, it discourages thorough planning. In the case of affirmative, where we have institutions that are thoroughly planning, in case of an unforeseen circumstance, we have bodies that are saying, okay, let's reserve money, let's carefully monitor our money is going, where our money is going, let's make plans, let's reserve, let's say in the case of the Ministry of Health, let's say saying things like, let's have extra ambulances, let's have extra masks, let's have extra health workers. It means that the ability to plan reduces on the over-reliance that is going to come about in these institutions, and it better fulfills the interests of the parliament, because the parliament wants to effectively govern its country. We told you in our interest. Secondly, in the point of in the point of corruption, I think when the second speaker comes and talks about corruption, it better exists on opposition's rejected. It better exists on opposition's bench, whereby you now have the government running to allocate money, and it means that the fear and the chaos is going to lead to people. Is going to lead to poor scrutiny, and it means that chances of corruption are going to be less. But even secondly, on the government panel, we tell you one thing: in the case where the budget has been passed, that if you're to post a supplementary budget, the question we ask opposition is, where does the money come from? In most cases, the money from a supplementary budget is either borrowed, which increases the debts that the government has to pay, or secondly, there's going to pull an immediate and rush strain on the citizens to provide taxes for the money to finance this supplementary budget. We don't think that is justified. We don't think that is what the parliament or the representatives or the people want in this scenario. Secondly, we bring a second argument, and it brings the failure to achieve long-term goals. Two layers on this. Firstly, it means that the government has to pause funding in the case of projects that is currently running. But secondly, it means that the government has to borrow money because it now has to get money for that supplementary budget in the case where its current money has already been allocated to different sectors. But even thirdly, on our last argument on inefficiency, we gave you three layers. Firstly, on the transfer embezzlement. Secondly, on the insufficient resources, since they now have to borrow money because the money has already been allocated. And thirdly and lastly, from the backlash. So in a general comparative, as my speech ends, we see that in opposition's bench, they have more inefficiency. They have poor institutions from the government, which is not what the parliament wants. And in the long run, they have low sustainability because of the government project being passed. And last year's government in today's debate, we achieve better for the parliament, we achieve better for the people, and we take the debate. Proud to propose, I rest my case.
Okay, thank you, second speaker, for that fine speech. That marks the end of that speech. Let's have Deputy Leader of Opposition to extend the case on the opposition team.
So I hope I'm pretty much audible. I'm going to begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Chair, one thing proposition fails to understand, i.e. the whole bench, we live in a dynamic world with nations on whether we're to be bombed by Al-Shabaab, or maybe we're going to wake up and become the next Palestine, Israel, or maybe we're going to have landslides to happen in Bududa again, or if Ladar to ambush Kasese. We think that because of these uncertainties, it is imperative for us to understand the need of the constant adjustment of the budget, proud to oppose. Two key things that I'm going to do for you in this debate. One, I'm going to do full-on rebuttal and refutation. Two, I'm going to do a bit of clashes while Larry would extend further on. But then firstly with rebuttal, they come and argue with tricky things into this debate. They come and tell us that, why is it then necessary to annul the act in the constitution? It's because of three things. Firstly, because it goes against the whole principle of proper planning and whatnot. Two key responses to this, chat. Notice every single budget should be open to change. Why is this so, Chair? Because you notice that, like I told you in my opening speech, you're not necessarily God to know that, oh, we're going to wake up and when the next Palestine is, or we're going to have floods in Gaza again, or maybe landslides in Buduna and whatnot. What does this then necessarily mean? It means that the essential key of our budget is to maybe plan for these particular unprecedented things, and at a point in time, these things are not necessarily present. We think that fails the primary role of a budget and whatnot. This is why then the supplementary budget is something that is then necessary on our side of the house. Why? Because you get to have some sort of proper planning in case there is this sort of unprecedented challenges that are then to occur at the end of the day. Then on the whole idea of flexibility, Chair, notice that at a point in time we have all these unprecedented, you get to have some sort of flexibility through adjusting because of the money that is then present from the supplementary budget. The impact of this then with the parliament is that you get to have this sort of role that you perform onto your people, and you're practically representing them in the best way possible as the parliament when you approve of the supplementary budget, because they then get to build their resilience in these particular areas, and you get to have some sort of relief provided to them at the end of the day. Clearly something opposition fails to understand. But then secondly, on the whole idea of accountability, which I'm going to combine with their whole references to corruption and whatnot that is then going to exist on that side of the house. Two key things here. We can see, Chair, there is no doubt here that corruption is something that exists on our side of the house. Something that again comes from Summerwood's speech that they fail to understand. We think that this is something entirely symmetric and exists on both sides of the house, because corruption is something that is inevitable in Uganda and something that cannot be avoided because we have corrupt MPs, we have leaders that do not fulfill the roles of their people. But then why is it then more on that side of the house? That's something that they fail to understand. That is that when the supplementary budget is removed, MPs are going to look for any sorts of crooks and panics to embezzle the money that's there in the actual budget in their particular sectors. What does this then necessarily mean? It means that the money that is then allocated to these particular areas it's going to end up being embezzled, and these particular areas are not going to have the right funding at the end of the day. Why is this then better on our side of the house, Chair? Notice that on our side of the house, you have scrutiny that then provides this sort of surveillance from opposition members through making sure that you have every single sort of every single allocation in the supplementary budget being followed and whatnot. What does this then necessarily mean? This comes from Samuel Witt's speech. The impact of this, Chair, is that you then have, okay, yes, even when corruption is there, then less when it comes to supplementary budget, and you're then able to cater for that flexibility, something that again they fail to understand. But the whole idea, the third argument that they bring into this debate, Chair, is on the raising or rushing, how MPs rush to scrutinize these things, so scrutinizing will not work at the end of the day. Chair, we think that at a point in time you have opposition members in parliament, does that find any sort of crooks and crannies at the end of the day, why you want to find some sort of
Speaker.
You then not taken. You then get to see that you're going to have some sort of accountability provided at the end of that day. Something again that they fail to understand. This then necessarily means that they're going to do their very best to keep the government on their toes so that you can then have that sort of accountability. We do that even when it's not necessarily happening. That's called proper. It can be things that is done much more better rather than annulling the whole idea of the constitution or the act of the constitution. Then fourthly, on the whole idea that they bring in, in the case where there is unforeseen circumstances, there are bodies to do these things and whatnot. So preparedness then happens on their side of the house. Yeah. Listen to how problematic this sounds. There is no going back here. Opposition fails on this. Two key things here. Which bodies, first of all, they did not even tell us which bodies or whether they are government or non-government that are going to provide for this preparedness. This is too late to come into their third stage. You think that it's already late for their argument, for this kind of substantial arguments to come to at the end of the day. But then even let's assume that it's a non-government organization. We think that it is very, very feeble for you to put a non-government in charge of providing disaster preparedness when it's not necessarily their actual responsibility. As a parliament, as a government body, or as an institution, it's your primary role to necessarily cater for your people. And at a point in time, you're not going to have a supplementary budget because, you know what, there are bodies that are going to provide for it, the non-government bodies. And we think that this is entirely bit feeble. What does this necessarily mean? Then the non-government bodies then get to become parliament and they get to become the bodies that are govern the country and whatnot. Why is this then necessarily important to consider in this debate, and the impact of this is that Parliament then gets to lose trust from its people. Parliament then loses its legitimacy as a parliament and does not fulfill its role. We think that then at that point in time, it's very imperative for us to then not consider this into this particular big debate. But even if it's government bodies, since they do not tell us what it actually is, even if it's government bodies, notice that then this would be a contradiction on that entire case. Why? Because even these particular government bodies, like the Ministry of Health or the Ministry of Disaster and Preparedness and Management, then become a sort of set. Then they become part of the body. Then they become then they sort of then these government bodies sort of become part of the budget, and they get to spend the budget and whatnot. And with that, I rest my case.
Okay, the House wants to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that speech. I'll now open the debate to the whip speeches. Government Whip, ready when you are. Jerry, is your mic now fine? Okay, yes, Jerry? It's really unfortunate. Jerry may be unable to speak within this round. I think probably because of your voice, it's still not audible anyways. Okay, let me have the person who did first speech submit the third speech.
Oh, Irene, can I and second and third? First speaker really can't do reply. We had agreed I do second and third.
Oh, sure, then he will do reply. No, that's awesome.
Okay, just give me a second. I begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. So, panel, if opposition is to come into today's debate and tell us that their main point of corruption is the existence of opposition parties, then we tell you that is symmetrical. But why that exists better on our side is that in the case where the budget takes longer and is scrutinized for a longer period by their opposition parties, it means that the chances of corruption are less on our side as compared to opposition. Proud to propose 3 things from my speech. Firstly, on engagement, I feel like the only credible thing we get from opposition bench is when they come and tell us that in the worst case scenario for government, where we have an unforeseen circumstances, we cannot be able to fulfill it. We counted this in our first and second speeches. We told you firstly, in the advent of no supplementary budget, it means that the chances of ministries or organizations better being accountable, better catering or better planning they themselves before the budget is passed, better planning for unforeseen circumstances. It means that the worst case scenarios of things like COVID-19 pandemic will not come to pass in today's debate. When they come and tell us things about flexibility, we believe that flexibility is kind of a wrong assumption, because if a parliament is something that is supposed to be rigid, it's supposed to be grant assurance to the people or assurance that what we are doing is right, then at the point where the parliament is then changing its laws or being flexible as they call it, the aspect of trust which they try to bring in actually falls on their side. But secondly, they come and tell us that, the MPs will start to look into the real budget. The real budget, which takes half or longer than your supplementary budget to take place, it means that MPs looking into budgets will exist less on our side because we have your opposition parties scrutinizing us for a longer period, other than the rushing or the rush scrutinization which exists on opposition side. 3 clashes in today's debate. I feel like the clash of efficiency comes and tells us that they believe efficiency happens in their side, because efficiency in terms of disasters, where they tell us that because we have a supplementary budget, we'll better cater for this. We still ask the question in the second speech, where does the money for supplementary budget come? Firstly, it comes from things like borrowing. And in the advent where countries are unable to borrow, even that supplementary budget fails because we are already in debt. But even secondly, when the government strain the citizens to acquire money through things like taxes, it means that even that money is going to be inefficient, because citizens, we can have things like backlash from the citizens. But even secondly, it means that the chances of corruption also exist on their side. And really showed you how that doesn't exist on our side. So on efficiency, we believe government takes it. Secondly, on the clash of sustainability. I think on sustainability, government takes it where we show you by institutions already prior to the budget passing being able to account for unforeseen circumstances, properly accounting for their money that is spent. This is something that opposition did not engage on. or governments or bodies, institutions and ministries being better accountable, it means that even the trust they're trying to bring on exists on our side, which is something that we believe also the parliament wants, right? Because they represent the people. So even on the point of sustainability, opposition loses it because they have more corruption, because they have less planning. So on the point of sustainability, you're having a country which is not going to be able to and for certain things and certain events, so they lose on sustainability. So on a general comparison, we see that opposition's world, where they try to tell us that we're going to be able to proper plan for things in the future, we're going to have to represent people in the future. We believe that better exists on our side because we have the money readily available, unlike opposition, and because we can scrutinize it for longer, unlike opposition, because we have less corruption, unlike opposition. So on burdens and problems, we see that opposition bench fails on that. I think when they come and basically on opposition's argumentation of flexibility, we have shown you how that is irrelevant. On necessity, we have shown you how on our side of the house, where it is not necessary because we are going to be able to proper plan. We have ministries. And even when the previous speaker comes and tells us that we give no alternative, we clearly told you in the second speech, we have ministries like Ministry of Disaster Preparedness, something which I think maybe she missed me talking about it. But we have ministries in place rejected. We have ministries or body in place to account unforeseen circumstances that already exists in the status quo. But we have told you, even if that is not present, we still have the bodies being more accountable, and even the parliament itself better representing the needs of the people. When they come and tell us about their third argument of development, we come and tell you that the pragmatic argument of development isn't necessarily important in today's debate, because we have shown that in of itself rejected. We have shown you even that in itself will not come to pass because of the problems we have put in opposition's case. So, Pano, as I end my speech, I just want to say that opposition's world may look good on paper, but the reality of the situation is that they're going to have less planning, less sustainability, less scrutiny, less development, and less preparedness. While in propositions world, we fronted for you a world where we have better strengthening of institutions. This not only applies to disasters, but generally in all formats, right? Because the institutions know that there's no emergency test, there's no emergency budget, going to be passed. It means that they'll be able to scrutinize. Back to the analogy my first speaker gave you. He told you that in the case where you're in class and you know that you can always take a retake, you won't be as serious to read for that test as you would be if there was no retake. Similar analogy here in today's debate. In the case where the institutions know there is no supplementary budget going to be passed, there's going to be more accountability, there's going to be more scrutiny, there's going to be better accounting for the money that is passed. So with that panel, I believe that proposition has won today's debate. We have counted for everything opposition has brought. I rest my case. Proud to propose.
Okay, the House wants to thank the government whip for that speech. We now call upon opposition whip to close the constructive speeches in this round.
First, I want to confirm if I'm audible.
Clearly audible.
Okay, I'd like to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Chair, now I'm going to begin with a bit of rebuttal and engagement on what they were saying. Notice that they claim that the budget takes a long time and has therefore a lot of scrutiny. The reason why the government takes a lot of time on the budget is because it's planning for the entire country and it's planning for different sectors and different government. That necessarily means it's going to mean more time to scrutinize all these different sectors that it's having. But notice that in case of a supplementary budget, it's put forth to address a specific problem that's affecting a particular sector in the government or in the society as a whole, necessarily meaning that the scope at which government is going to be planning for this, going to be scrutinizing this supplementary budget, it's much smaller because it's planning for a specific problem that has arose due to the unpredictability of our nature, necessarily meaning that we do not need the lengthy procedures that they talk about in their case, because the problem that we're tackling is small and the level of scrutiny is going to be higher because there's going to be a higher concentration on that particular issue and not on the general government as a whole, necessarily meaning that we still have a level of scrutiny that is equivalent to the year planning that they're talking about on our side of the scale. This is why we think we win on this argument. Moving on, just going through the debate and how it falls through. Notice that they talked about how the interest of the parliament is governance for a sustainable country. But notice that because of what we're bringing forth in our substantive speeches, we're talking about how things are so unpredictable. So if government is going to officially or properly govern its citizens, it needs to be able to provide these services, necessarily meaning that it's justifiable for there to be a supplementary budget. Then the first speaker talked about how there's an over-reliance on the supplementary budget and it destroys accountability. Notice that this point falls out because government still plan for it, but there are needs that come out unpredictably, necessarily meaning that we're going to have government planning, and in case the needs arises, we have the money to actually pursue it. Then they also talked about how the money is borrowed from investors, therefore, I mean borrowed from people, increasing the strain on the people and increasing public debt. Notice that on their side, they still have large ounces of public debt because the money that were being provided from the sustained supplementary budget is going to be used to develop economic sectors within the country that are going to be income generating, necessarily increasing the income of the people, reducing the initial strain caused by the supplementary budget, and also allowing for us to tackle the public debt because the government is going to be earning more money because the supplementary budget has been able to save certain structures and infrastructure. And notice on their side that because the government is rigid and it's not flexible, it's going to alternate in terms of budget allocations. You're going to find that, for example, money is going to be deviated from the Ministry of Finance and Training and whatever, and money is going to be taken from one area to another to tackle the specific unprepared problem. For example, money being deviated from the tourism sector to the health sector, necessarily meaning that you're deriving the development of the tourism sector that could possibly become a greater income generating sector and will reduce on the public debt. Moving on, an engagement of what they have been saying throughout this debate, notice that they talked about the clashes, and the clashes were on flexibility. Notice that they talked about borrowing leading to debt, but I've shown you how this borrowing is necessary in the short term to enable the growth of these sectors, to tackle the problems that have been hurting them, essentially allowing for them to grow up and cover the debt later in the future. While on their side, they continue to have public debt because they're still going to be borrowing from citizens, there's still going to be economic stress, and there's still going to be problems that are going to be faced by the government. Then they also talk about how they increase the chances of corruption. But notice the layer of mechanisms that my first speaker talked about, where there's level of parliament scrutiny by the government. They talked about how we have opposition members of parliament who are then going to be more scrutinous of this supplementary budget to expose cases of corruption. That necessarily is on our side, and they tried to talk about how it's in the long term, but to have shown you why it is not necessary for the supplementary budget to take such a long time to achieve a high voting. Then they talked about sustainability, how there's no trust in the government, how there's no trust in the parliamentary people, but we actually have trust on our side because people are able to actually see that their government officials, the parliamentary budget is being passed through scrutiny from the parliament. So on that point of trust, we actually take it on our side, and we have better sustainability because we allow for borrowing that one might hurt us on the short term, but in the long term enables the growth of economic sectors that enable improvement of the society as a whole by increasing income in the country, necessarily meaning that we have long-term sustainability of the country because we're having growth of different economic sectors. So moving on a comparison on how this debate went, notice that we win this debate on efficiency and sustainability because of the mechanisms of analysis that my previous speakers had talked about. Then we also win this debate on the point of efficiency because I'm able to show you how adequate with the scrutiny process and why it is justifiable to have the supplementary budget because of the unpredictable nature of our world. They talked about how there are presence of bodies such as the Ministry of Planning and Disaster Preparedness. But notice that even that ministry can still be facing challenges in terms of planning for something as unpredictable as the COVID-19 pandemic. You can't tell me that there's going to be a government body that's going to provide funds, you're going to tackle it, like the health sector is going to provide funds for the COVID-19 pandemic, which it didn't know was going to happen the following year. So their point on their being planning on their side is inherently going to fall down because there are things that you cannot plan for due to the volatility and the highly unstable nature of our world. This is why it is necessary for us to have this supplementary budget that can actually tackle these different problems that come pandemic, which I've already referenced. So weighing this debate on two sides, one, we have a side where we have actual scrutiny, and the scrutiny is actually to a high degree to the prevalence of opposition members, and the level which we are seeing it is still equal to that of the long-term scrutiny because it's on a specific problem, and the supplementary budget is not on a large scale like the governmental budget, meaning that we do not need as much time. Two, we win this debate on efficiency, and we have better efficiency on our side because we're able to tackle the problems by the cabinet and protected time, and we're able to actually address them as need be. And by addressing this problem, greater economic growth, by expansion of economic sectors that would be income generating and providing more services to the people, necessarily reducing the initial strain that we might have caused from borrowing from them and leading to the alleviation of governmental debt. Notice that we continue to win this debate because we're able to show you why adequately having the supplementary budget is actually necessary to continue with this debate. And with that, I'm proud of pause.
Okay, thank you, third opposition speaker. That marks the end of the constructive speeches. Let's have the first reply speech. Opposition, ready when you are.
Okay, so can I confirm audibility?
Clearly audible.
Okay, so I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Chair, we clearly apologize for the logical inconsistencies that affirmative shows us throughout the debate. So things I'm going to engage and clearly show you what is actually an opposition win. First and foremost, they come and give us a retake analogy. At a point in time, once we actually don't have, for example, a retake, people are going to be very more serious. But so we tell you in our speeches, throughout our opposition speeches, at a point in time, once you have unexpected outcomes, at a point in time, probably I get engaged in an accident, or I probably haven't finished tuition, it means that my whole life has actually been spoiled. Why? Because there similarly to the governance of the country. At a point in time, once we actually don't have the supplementary budget request, which clearly affirmative does not even understand how the supplementary budget works. But then here is the clarity, Chair. In Appropriation Act, it means that once you're supposed to have, like once you're supposed to be given the supplementary budget, it means that one, there is purpose for like a purpose you have not actually been like a purpose that has not been planned for, then the supplementary budget is given to you. But then secondly, once the money is actually inefficient, like insufficient, or like there is a need that was not planned for has risen, then the supplementary budget request is then given. Or lastly, or when this expenditure, like for example, once this expenditure is risen, like there is more expenditure at the end of the day, or like there's excess money like after the projects or anything of that sort, Parliament takes that incentive to actually ask for accountability performance of the month. So that's how we clearly how the supplementary budget actually works. But then first and foremost, they clearly don't show us how Parliament's objectives are actually fulfilled. We show you that in our budget, we show you that it's not actually justified or right to abrogate or eliminate government from pursuing any supplementary budget request. They come and ask us questions like, where does money come from? Chair, that argument is clearly cannot actually clearly be credited. Why? We clearly like the whole debate is about whether it's justified as the Parliament of Uganda to prevent government from ever pursuing any supplementary budget request. But let us take them at their best. Even if they come and tell us that the Ministry of Disaster Preparedness actually has these funds and all that, at a point in time where it's like an epidemic or like a greater effect, like for example, landslides in Bududa, and probably when there is money lacking, what happens in their world, it means that this government is going to actually be handcuffed and does not have any other alternative. What is going to happen is that there's going to be delayed response from their side. Civilians are going to actually have problematic consequences, either death or even hunger at the end of the day. But then secondly, we come and show you that from our side of the house, we think that development is going to actually be better once there is probably a purpose that needs money. We think that developments are going to actually be better. Why? Because once these developments are in existence, what is going to happen is that this money is going to be invested, and at a point in time, all the ideas of like debts and all that is actually covered. Like how my third speaker comes and tells you that this money is going to be regained, even though there's a short impact like harm at the end of the day. And that is why we think that has no justification, but then has to be able to actually fulfill the needs and like interests of the citizens for a better future for each and everyone. And that's why we think, and we are very proud to propose, why we wouldn't actually eliminate government from pursuing any supplementary budget request. That's a clear up win. With that, I beg to submit.
Okay, so thank you, opposition reply, for that speech. Let us have proposition reply, close this debate.
Okay, so am I audible?
A minute, I don't seem to hear you. Am I audible though?
Am I audible?
Someone else confirm I'm audible?
Am I now audible? Can you now get me?
Okay, let me try disconnecting and reconnect again.
We can hear him, Rin. I think it's your gadgets.
Okay, am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible, but now can you get me, Rin?
Yeah, I can get you pretty well.
Okay. Now, the first question aside affirmative is, as a Ministry of Health, which is in its sane mind, when we're drawing out a budget, wouldn't we obviously try to look for any disasters which can come? Wouldn't any sane institution actually try to think about all the foreseeable disasters which can actually come? Now, this is where I'll start my speech off by showing you what we're trying to answer. The thing is, every institution is actually going to look into what it should handle. So if there's no supplementary budget, this means an institution is actually going to try to plan out well for all the unforeseeable circumstances that can happen. So in our world, this is actually a world where the Ministry of Health would actually have planned better for COVID-19 with the money it had. This wouldn't be a ministry which would be hoping that we can actually get more money. So you come to realize that more money would actually be put into planning. So you already come to see that everything side negative came to put out of. There's actually side negative tries to bring out in their world that there are unforeseeable circumstances and so on. You already see that already doesn't count because every proper institution already plans for those as status quo already has it. And then when we look into money not being enough, now second speech, we come and show you that there's a Ministry of disaster preparedness, which would already step in case of disaster. So already in our world, there's not that entire argument that we wouldn't be ready for this unforeseeable action. That doesn't stand in today's debate. Then when we go into money being regained, now side affirmative side negative believe that money would be regained better in the world because money can actually be got back. But now the issue now comes in, we come and ask a very important question: how are we getting the money? We already show you that this money is actually being gained through debt and so on. But then if this is money being gained through debt, in their world, they don't already give an incentive to stop that debt. And on top of that, there are already people in their world who are already corrupt, hungry. If they just want to make money, they can always just go make money. So in their world, there's not already enough incentive for these people to actually be looked at better. But in our world where they are not actually going to be gaining more money, there's already an incentive for the fact that they would have to be working with the best that they have. So they are being pushed to be more accountable. So there's already more incentive taking out issues of corruption in our world. Then when we look into other factors such as backlash of with investors, we show you that this is a world where government is actually more reliable because we are not actually picking a lot. But in their world, this is a world where government is still going to grab out more money. So already in their world, they already lose out on governance since they're not actually a reliable government. I rest my case.
Okay, thank you, Speaker. That marks the end of this round. Guys, just gonna give me. I think your call is ready. I just wanna pick up something in a few, then come in about 2-3 minutes. Okay, so let's go about this call real quick. So as a solo the solo judge, so there'll be no need for deliberation anyway. So I'm gonna give the call straight away and justification for the same. Just before that, I'm just gonna do a couple of things within general feedback. I definitely think it might be really important because I feel like to some extent this round would definitely go otherwise, to any specific team. So perhaps I felt like if there was a level of engagement in terms of POIs and responses, maybe it would have easily tilted my call in terms of the responses that I likely get from those points of information. Unfortunately, that didn't happen within this specific round. I think this song, we shall sing it over and over again. But yeah, I want you guys try to prove why those things are likely going to happen on your side of the house. Why is it much more likely that the supplementary budget might be effective or less likely going to be effective within the same regard? So a level of proof in terms of the likelihood of the impacts are things that are pretty lacking. But I think we can most of that stuff with constant practice within that extent in terms of so when you're trying to prove the probability of the outcomes or the probability of an impact existing, you always kind of couple that up with things to do generally with current trends or existing things that much more likely may kind of influence or instigate the symptoms. If you want to say that a specific actor X is more likely going to be part of this cause, you want to explain why that's possibly true. You want to explain the incentives of the actor and maybe try to do a correlation or deduction that the specific policy you're advancing directly fits the interest of the actor. I think much more likely things that we're flying within the debate look like, well, NGOs are likely going to fund anyways, or we have them existing with the status quo. I'm still quite unsure why NGOs have an active incentive to fund such programs and why they likely do that. I think oftentimes you want to talk about things like the kind of like much more likely humanitarian organizations. So they're interested among things that oppress individuals. So because like externalities definitely do hit people in the vast majority of instances, it definitely means they have an incentive to do that. The reason why they do this is simply quite very basic. Probably they want to be best setters, they want to be looked at as individuals who resolve things around oppression. And I think just generally it's because of the kind of like pride and prestige that's attached with that kind of, say, for instance, such positive acts of heroism that ultimately happens anyways. And that's why it's more likely that you have these NGOs coming on board and helping us within like that trigger. So like you want to like kind of prove in most cases why the things are likely going to happen. So I judge this specific debate on a couple of things. One was necessity. Secondly, was on efficacy, and then lastly was on the utility you derive out of the team cases. Generally, I give this win to proposition over opposition. So proposition won this round. I'll do a couple of things. I think generally in terms of the necessity for this, I definitely think what proposition was pushing for is the idea of why this is likely going to create a reluctancy in most cases for individuals who are likely working. They say the sort of obligation of parliament is much more likely about planning anyways. So at a point in time that much more likely you have things like supplementary budgets existing, there is a level of reluctance you create on that particular sort of system. The problem then with this is that in most cases, you likely get a backlash from investors anyways. Though I don't like really feel this push on investors is something that duly mechanized on why that's likely going to exist and why I need to about that specific impact. So like, what do we definitely lose if investors roll out of such systems anyways? I think that impact was pretty lacking in terms of proving that specific. What they say anyways is this, investors likely have or feel more secure investing within, say for instance, countries that have like a proper record in terms of things like planning anyways. I'm less likely sure why that is true and why, say for instance, the alternative in terms of them not investing is much more likely existent at a point in time that that kind of like planning and scrutiny doesn't like definitely exist. I think the second thing that comes from proposition was largely in the mode of accountability. They say, well, in most cases, the problem here is that there is likely room for more corruption because you create insufficient funds for these individuals to kind of like swindle that specific money. And that's definitely more harmful in terms of a couple of things. One, the idea that you often need to draw like a constant budget. The problem with this particular budget, I think this was like largely on the aspect of things like sustainability. That is one, in terms of you as a country being incapacitated because of things like debts that you likely have. But secondly, why, if it's likely an otherwise solution in terms of how you're likely going to do funding, it's more evident that that specific burden is pushed onto the citizens anyways. I don't definitely buy into the arguments on things like finances. I don't like really think there's like an intrinsic burden to prove within the specific debate. But I think just because it went like on both ends, I probably had to judge the debate on that specific clash, because I definitely think the aspect of funding definitely is something that is fiated within a specific motion. Yeah, however, I think that the claim on sustainability, on whether these supplementary budgets are likely going to be more sustainable, is a valid stance. But the proof on whether we would have funding or not have funding is inherently a clash out of this debate anyways, given the fact that the presumption is that government will be able to definitely implement this specific sort of like policy with like whatever funds available as they deem desirable anyway, given the fact that in cases there are the parliamentarians who are likely making up decisions so they can find all feasible capacity. I mean, if there is like an innate sort of like a proof on why this is urgent, then I think extremely there might be an incentive for government to take this to that particular extreme and definitely invest within the systems because it's worth the investment anyways. So I think like the debate would be like more nuanced in terms of explaining why this mechanism either like prompts bad governance or is likely going to lead to like bad outcomes, or on the flip end proving why that's likely effective. Let's get up in. I think a push on opposition is quite more simple, that you need a lot of responsive mechanisms in terms of solving the problems of human beings. I think the biggest issue here was to say that we exist in a world that is kind of randomized. There are a lot of externalities that ultimately do exist within the vast majority of instances. They said the interest then of this particular parliament is definitely to have a key obligations to things like citizens anyways, since they're likely going to vote them. I'm still quite unsure why this is like the ultimate in of parliament anyways. Most of the things that we said are likely more of a claim game as opposed to mechanizing why those things are generally the case anyways. So like really, we need like kind of like invest more time in terms of buttressing such specific ideas. I feel like they're kind of like pretty brilliant. Which also here is to say that, oh, they're likely more interested in things like making policies to fulfill their interest and also kind of elevate things like service delivery. I think after establishing these two claims on both ends, the most important thing now was to proving why those claims are better implemented or better mechanized on their ends of the house using whatever policy they likely kind of suggest. I think generally, in terms of the debate, opposition idea on the aspect of corruption is to say, or I think corruption on your side of the house is definitely kind of worsened. Why is that true? Is that you kind of like create an incentive for these individuals to necessarily kind of exploit more resources from that end in that particular sort of system. So much more likely you stifle mechanisms in which definitely these individuals would have got money. I feel like this specific argument was kind of self-contradictory, right? Because to some extent, at a point in time that yes, you acknowledge that there exists a level of corruption within Sedasco, but then you say, well, when you remove a supplementary budget, it much more likely means that you stifle ways in which these, say for instance, parliamentarians can survive. So definitely they use any kind of existing loopholes in terms of, say for instance, getting finances. It's still then very certain that the reason why you create that supplementary budget is in most cases to definitely create enough funds for these individuals to definitely kind of swindle. I think then that kind of like validated opposition's claim onto why, say for instance, corruption in most instances is much more likely going to propel things like corruption. I think that's why I was able to buy into the latter impact that comes through the second speech in terms of the tax burden. I think I'll be able to chip in that within my OA. I think the second thing here, and generally think was like largely in response, was to say, or I don't necessarily think, because these two claims became self-contradictory. When you talk about the corruption aspect and within your second claim is to say that, oh, we don't necessarily think this money is ultimately just dashed out. I think there are specific mechanisms of scrutinizing before this money is definitely going to be kind of allocated anyways. I think as though to explain why there would be likely proper management or like allocation of funds, I don't really think this conclusion really comes out of your specific case. I think two things then you have here. One is likely on flexibility, but secondly on why this is likely necessary. I think let me just get to the level of engagement within this specific debate round. I think the clarity I got from like proposition is to say that I think unforced circumstances can still all be capped within Sedasco anyways. The issue is that within our world, we get to plan with the specific funds that are available within that kind of financial year. And I think that became more feasible to me in terms of the capacity of why that's likely going to be more sustainable anyways. If you're much more likely planning your expenditure based on how much definitely income you have within that specific sort of regard. I think the alternative and much more likely to respond to the entire idea of, say, for instance, why this is likely going to be a bad thing and likely going to coerce individuals to that specific extent was to say, oh, we have like an alternative response to most of these big problems you think really are big problems. We have organizations, e.g. like refugees, sort of like organizations that much more likely do these particular things. Was a valid sort of like response in terms of an existing mechanism to resolve almost of those issues. However, the biggest problem I had still, though still not responded to in opposition, was you didn't like kind of explain to me why these particular organizations are more likely going to be effective in terms of something I started with within my general feedback on as to why are these particular things likely going to be effective in terms of resolving those things. I think also the second thing they say was likely in why this is likely going to be more inefficient and much more likely propel things like corruption. I think I already explained how they explained that anyways. What I think you claim anyways, but you're less likely mechanizing it, was the idea of proper planning bringing things like development. And so my question is definitely if the interest of government, or if the interest is things like better government, why is it the specific interest and why is that particular interest likely going to be, say for instance, be achieved when you kind of eliminated this? I think the entire argument here was onto why probably you need to track down these specific systems and how much money they're likely doing. I much more likely bought into generally the impact that came from proposition end on the tax burden, and why definitely at a point in time the sustainability is something that you don't guarantee in your side of the house, then it's much more likely we wash this specific argument anyways on opposition end. I think it became more viable onto why backlash is more likely on opposition end, because these two specific arguments were able to prove why, say for instance, this is less likely sustainable. Then there would be still massive apathy or resentment from, say for instance, the citizens that exist within such specific communities. And now it might be more important to have a specific budget allotted to, say for instance, things like planning anyways. So at a point in time that randomization may not propel or have things like sustainable funds within that particular extent, I think then it became more fluid that you want to have a system where you have like stipulated amounts of money to do particular things within that regard. I definitely think that's a clear attempt in terms of the comparative on opposition. I say like it was like fairly good responses on both ends anyways, because opposition is still able to respond to a couple of things here. But I think most impacts on op are less likely important because you don't explain why do things inherently affect people or why I ought to care about them. Say for instance, you say, we think there is a need for you to often like kind of readjust budgets because of externalities. So your claim here is to say that, budgets ought not to be, or budgets ought to be open to things like change. I'm still not very sure what the impact is on things like stakeholders when a budget is like pretty fixed and it's less likely kind of changing based on things like dynamics anyways. So maybe you want to explain why that could be an inherent enslavement of people's, say for instance, ability to counteract specific problems, and why that would be intrinsically bad is because it much more likely, say for instance, worsens the situations of the most vulnerable within society. And that's something that you have an active incentive as parliamentarians to definitely kind of like rival and kind of like change anyways at the end of the day. So when you say that, flexibility should be about things like practical representation of these individuals, I'm still unsure why this is crucially very important within that specific sort of like extent anyways. I think generally the entire argument on things like corruption was like a two-way sort of like clash on both ends anyways. I think still opposition is also able to kind of like respond and maybe talk about things why you create an incentive to exploit more money if, say for instance, this money doesn't exist. But I think I'm able to highlight and show why I feel like this was like self-contradictory at a point in time that you want to both like kind of solve corruption. I think for a more case on solvency, I think to a kind of like a large extent, proposition is able to prove why if you do away with that kind of, say for instance, supplementary budget, you much more likely kind of like do not provide sufficient amount of money for these individuals likely to swindle. Your claim on your end was to say, so if this budget definitely doesn't exist, is to say that, people likely now look for other ways to swindle money anyways. So it much more likely meant that, let's provide the funds for them. Those funds are the ones that could definitely swindle. So like on who better like kind of solves corruption, I think I'm much more likely able to buy into like definitely prop case anyways. The other claim you have on opposition is to say, I think NGOs are not like likely feasible to control things like externalities that happen within this specific country. My question is, why is that likely so anyways? So maybe you might help to couple this with kind of like explanation onto why, say for instance, if like there's an existence of NGOs in terms of curbing this, it creates on like, I think this could even just tie back to kind of like win that claim on proposition. If like your claim is to say that we create reluctancy, I think you create reluctancy more on your side of the house. Yeah, in terms of definitely divert and put the things in the hands of NGOs. And aside is more better because we likely call systems to call them out definitely. If governments have to do particular things, but NGOs that are like taking the front, government, it much more likely means that there is a reluctance on the government and to do particular things because they didn't know the NGOs, there is like a presence of things like NGOs at the end of the day anyways. So when you say party is likely going to lose its legitimacy, I'm still not quite sure why the loss of legitimacy from parliament is a bad thing anyways. Why would that worsen governance on your side of the house? I think generally in terms of like this debate, proposition is able to win on specific clashes, and I think I buy into most of the impacts that come from prop in terms of, like, say for instance, the tax burden on these individuals. I don't get any response whatsoever why this is something that ain't, like, definitely bad. There is something that you come and attempt within the third speech of opposition. I feel like if this particular sort of, like, response was mechanized truly well, it would be like a sufficient response to cramp down that argument on, like, say for instance, the tax burden anyways. So maybe you want to explain that, or because this is the claim that, oh, there is still public debt that's likely existing on your side of the house. However, if you consider that, you want to explain maybe in your side of the house what if you definitely have a supplement budget, you much more likely create capacity mechanisms for these individuals to pay back those particular loans anyways. So it could be like analysis to explain that, oh, I think externalities hit our societies, they kind of, like, cause impoverishment in most of, like, the societies in terms of, say for instance, okay, it could be like a cramp down in things like industries anyways. So people might significantly lose jobs within the short run. So when you have a supplementary budget within this particular sort of time frame, you provide enough disposable income for these individuals to take up alternative mechanisms in terms of, like, kind of like survival. It means smart people are likely going to, say for instance, create their own jobs, so likely they have the capacity to pay things like taxes in ways. So we don't necessarily disagree. There is a huge portion of, say for instance, the debt, but our side at least gives you an active step, an active incentive to try and resolve those particular debts that exist anyways. When you create infrastructure, that's much more likely going to give people the capacity of, like, revive from the countries that exist within that particular extent anyways. I think also entire aspect on party presence and opposition is something that definitely you don't kind of, like, mechanize well. Maybe you want to explain why those significant presence of parties is something that actively creates pressure on governments in terms of, like, questioning that specific authority. So why is that likely going to be an effective solution? So you think because most of the governments came into system through things like oppositions, the much more likely mean that they could necessarily lose power if that opposition gets significant kind of, like, strength from things like systems or, like, society support and all that kind of thing. So because you also definitely know that as a government, you have an active incentive to appease masses. So you're much more likely going to change your mechanisms simply because there is a presence of an opposition that definitely amounts a significant portion of pressure onto you as a system at the end of the day. I think generally there's an ability on proposition to explain why, say for instance, planning ought to be in tandem with things like available finances. And at a point in time that this doesn't definitely happen, you get more backlash anyways. Either one, because taxes are likely, say for instance, heavily burdened on these individuals, or secondly, why already you have like budgetary constraints, and this is like adding to already that huge portion of something that you definitely haven't yet resolved at the end of the day. I think generally in terms of like necessity and necessity, both teams do good to prove why this is likely something that they ought to or not ought to do. But I think like on the level of like the utility or the impact that comes out of those specific cases, there's like a lack in terms of engagement and opposition to prove why, say for instance, those particular impacts on proposition end are less likely things we don't need to care about, or much more likely things that we don't need to solve, or maybe they would solve better on their side of the house without existing mechanisms. I think that's like pretty much it. I want to hope that this was like comprehensive enough to help us grow as speakers. And finally, I want to kind of like roll into another session at around, in around 10 minutes. So I definitely think I'll have to go off this call. I don't know whether I was audible enough, but yeah, that's it.
I have a small question.
Yeah, sure, ask.
You talked about how there's a burden on the taxpayer and how there's debt. But in my third speech, I tried to tackle that by saying that the money that's got from these people, true, it might cause some sort of negative impact on them, but it's going to be used to supply the supplementary budget that's used to develop economic sectors that are income generating in the country, necessarily meaning that money is going to be returned back to the taxpayer to the income they'll be generating from these public sectors, necessarily reducing the initial strain. And also, the money that's bought from that sector can also be used to pay off public debt. I don't know if that was
Okay, I think it doesn't just come out within your speech like you try now, because now that is like more nuanced in terms of the explanation. What you say within your speech is that, oh, I think we need this particular, because your push is that we need to increase things like service delivery from your second speech. No, that's like first speech. That way, yeah, we need to increase things like service delivery. I think the exact extent of your explanation is to say that, oh, I think we're going to increase service delivery at a point in time that we are able to develop things like infrastructure that are likely going to benefit this particular individual. You don't exclusively kind of highlight why, say, for instance, the development of that particular infrastructure could provide now mechanisms that could be responsive enough in terms of that specific burden. But even if that's likely the case, you want to explain why it is still important, even when there is an extent of a tax burden onto this, because that specific idea doesn't like wholly respond to the idea of when you get backlash within the short run. So you want to explain why definitely maybe the investment is like kind of worth it, and more individuals are likely going to be appreciative of that particular sort of incentive to that particular extent anyways. So I feel like if that came in terms of mechanizing why that is likely a better solution in terms of, say, for instance, it could be a worthy trade-off for these individuals to definitely do. Like, it's much more like a motion on supporting Marxism, right? So the idea is that you have no alternative to the situation you're getting to live in. So much more likely there's an active incentive at least to do something about your problem. So you don't like really care whether you're likely going to lose or you're likely going to die within such an extreme sort of action. All you care is that you try to do something about the situation. The guarantee is that you will still die anyway. Maybe probably the pain would just be prolonged, but you'd still die anyway. So it's just like a tie-in analysis to explain why there would be an active incentive for these individuals to definitely kind of like prompt this and definitely support it anyways. That wouldn't be like any significant backlash anyways. It might be a reason, maybe you could justify that, oh, I think this is like the reason why people in status quo still definitely still, even when there are existing and extremely hard laws or hard penalties, it might be embedded back into the moral fiber. The idea that people want to definitely, say, for instance, solely kind of like provide to their families, even when they are unable to. So because such specific things do exist anyways, people are willing to go extreme miles in order for them to provide to like their families, etc. anyways. I think that by particular actions could be even when they're likely bad actions anyways at the end of the day. So like all you care about are like basic necessities and how to get that. So if like that explains and ties back to an analysis of like creating, like, say, for instance, infrastructure, you want to explain why that infrastructure is kind of adhesive to the core of basic necessities of these individuals, of these societies in which these people likely live in. I think that becomes more kind of like, say, for instance, buttressed in terms of proving why actually this action ought to be taken and why it's likely going to be effective. Does that like kind of respond to you?
Yeah.
Okay, guys. Yes.
I'm just requesting for clarification on what you called a contradiction, because on the response to corruption,